education session, and it's for everybody, but it's mainly for the commissioners to try to teach us what's right and wrong. But we want to welcome everybody to Percy Quinn. It's a beautiful place. It's been really renovated. The cabins we stayed in last night, I think we were the first ones to stay in them since they've been renovated. They were really nice. This is another Mississippi secret, these state parks. I mean, they're absolutely beautiful, and I just tell you, half of our population or more hadn't got a clue that this place is down here. Belongs to the state, and just look at it. And we even found out who Mr. Percy Quinn was. He's a United States congressman back in Talent looked it up on the phone, like 1910 or 1912 to like 1930 something. So learned a little bit of something today. Today is like I say, it's an education thing. Russ is going to be in charge, and this is on supplemental feeding. So, Mr. Posey, you got anything you'd like to add?
Just briefly wanted to let everyone know that the commission charged our biologists to put this presentation together, and we think it's very interesting and should be very informative. And we're streaming this education session here today, and it'll also be placed on YouTube after the fact. So if you have some friends who maybe didn't have a chance to see it live, it will be on YouTube. So just want to let everybody know that. So Russ, whenever you're ready, we are.
Sorry about that. In the context of supplemental feeding, the question is, why do people do it? And so the intent often is to improve wildlife health or reproductive capacity, facilitate growth, facilitate harvest, or wildlife viewing. That's often, if you were to ask folks why they do it, these are the explanations and the reason that you will hear about. But the question that surrounds all of that is the risk greater than the benefit, or the benefit greater than the risk? So today we're going to look at the risk as it is associated with supplemental feeding, and we'll talk a little bit more about defining supplemental feeding here in just a minute. One thing to point out here is that when supplemental feeding was legalized in Mississippi, in state statute, it authorized the commission to allow that and allow the taking of deer with supplemental feed. But along with that statute also comes the provision that it would be studied and looked at about how supplemental feeding not only impacts the deer population, but also impacts wildlife health, and again, the risk of disease there. So this is a statutory requirement for us to look into this, evaluate this, and study this. So one important distinction before we go through all the presentation today is to distinguish between what we're really talking about here. We're not talking about the feed itself. A lot of folks will hear talking about supplemental feeding and the risk of disease and CWD. And it's important to understand that we are not talking about the actual feed itself. So feeding corn is not what spreads CWD or not what spreads disease. It is not the feed itself. We want to focus on the mechanism of feeding, if you will, and that is placing feeders on the landscape and unnaturally concentrating those animals at the same location day in and day out for long periods of time. The actual bringing those animals to a feeding site and them sharing that site, whether it be multiple species or the same species, over and over and over again. So again, it's not the feed, it is the mechanism of feeding. It is bringing those animals together for extended periods of time to the same location. So in this presentation, we want to kind of tie a circular relationship together, if you will. So briefly I talked about the mechanism of feeding, and we'll get into more of that here in a second. But then the wildlife interactions that the mechanism, again, those interactions between species and within species that occur around those feeder sites, and then the risk of disease transmission between those animals or from the environment, and then going all the way back to the feeder itself. And we'll look at some results here that research has found about actual, in this case, CWD prions that are deposited on the feeder itself. So all of this is a circular relationship, and we'll dive a little more in detail on these particular topics. So let's start with the mechanism of feeding. So if you look at wildlife in general, foraging behavior naturally, they spend a lot of time foraging just to meet energy demands. So while they may visit some of the same areas across several days or weeks or whatever, they're not coming back to the same exact location over and over and over again. They're going to spend time going over a broad geographic area again, finding those seasonal food sources, meeting those energy demands. You see a picture here of a well-managed forest, of the burned upland hardwood forest. You can see there's a lot of forage at ground level, as well as there'd be acorns in the fall, so hard mast in the fall. So well-managed forest, a lot of good habitat, a lot of opportunity for them to meet their energy demands in a natural setting. If you go over to the feeding side of this, in an artificial foraging setting, if you will, feeding from stationary above ground covered feeders, which is what is legal in Mississippi. It's actually required for you to use an above ground covered feeder if you're going to supplemental feed. So that may be spin cast, gravity trough, whatever it may be. But this is an artificial setting. Again, is bringing animals to the same exact location day in and day out. Usually a feeder stay in the same place, sometimes for years. And so those animals become habituated to coming to that centralized location over and over and over again, which again is completely not natural, if you will, when you look at the normal behavior of animals, whether we're talking about deer, turkeys, or whatever it may be. A little bit further down into the mechanism of feeding, if you look at some of the research that's been done here in Mississippi, deer feeders were visited 3 times more by white-tailed deer than mass trees or food plots. So you can see that research shows that they absolutely visit feeders more than they do other food sources. A statewide feeder density estimate by MSU was around 118,000 feeders. So you see the opportunity for animals on the landscape to be concentrated around feeders is certainly great. That's about a feeder per 13 deer across the state. So you can see that again the opportunity for animals to be congregated in Mississippi is certainly there. So let's move to wildlife interactions. So a 2017 survey by MSU to our Deer Management Assistance Club showed that 87% use corn as their primary supplement. We all know that a lot of animals like to eat shelled corn. And it's readily consumed by white-tailed deer, wild turkeys, wild hogs, raccoons, black bears, songbirds, and other wildlife species. It's certainly a carbohydrate that's readily used throughout the year, but certainly in the wintertime. So a lot of animals are going to want to come to these feeders again, and we show that that's the primary supplement used across the state. So this near constant availability of food does 2 things. First is it causes the frequent and close interactions between wildlife species. See this picture here, we have a wild hog, we have raccoons, we have deer, all in the same picture, all at the same location, feeding at the same time in very close proximity to one another. Again, on the natural landscape, this just does not occur. At feeder sites is where this relationship begins to really just break down the natural order of things. The second thing that the wildlife interactions that we see here is the close interaction, in this case, between social groups of white-tailed deer. Ordinarily on the landscape, doe groups, a doe family group, a mom and a yearling and a fawn or 2 fawns, whatever it may be, they don't interact normally with each other across the landscape. They may live in proximity to one another, but they don't interact. But we see that at feeder sites, this breaks down. You see in this particular picture here, you have multiple family groups, as well as bucks, as well as raccoons, interacting on the landscape around a feeder site. Research shows by MSU with collared animals, those doe groups are distinctly unique on the landscape. They do not normally interact with one another. But in Mississippi and other states that have done feeder research here, that normal behavior of, yeah, we live close to one another, but we don't interact, that breaks down at the feeder site. You can see that evidence here by this picture. So let's talk a little bit about disease transmission. So we know that the mechanism of feeding unnaturally concentrates animals. It doesn't just have to be deer. It can be multiple wildlife species. We know that it brings all of those animals together in that unnatural setting. Provides the opportunity for the breakdown of those social groups. Then let's move to disease transmission. So the concentration of these animals over and over and over again at the same location, you're going to have deposits of saliva, you're going to have deposits of feces and urine concentrated around those sites. And we know that from an environmental contamination standpoint, if that animal is diseased, then the concentration of those disease agents or disease vectors is going to be concentrated at these sites. Again, and we'll talk a little bit about certain diseases here in just a minute. But those vectors are going to be concentrated there. So while the conversation has been a lot about CWD over the past years and not concentrating animals because of the risk of CWD, the broader suite of diseases has to be part of this conversation and part of this context. And some examples here of some diseases are aflatoxicosis, avian pox, tuberculosis, brucellosis, CWD, coccidiosis, leptospirosis, toxoplasmosis. Whether these are fungal or viral or bacterial or parasitic, these are certainly diseases, and this is not an all-inclusive list. This is just some examples of diseases that we know wildlife carry. We know that the opportunity for them to spread these diseases, again, at central locations, is exponentially increased by the use of feeders. And all but one of these has been detected in Mississippi. The only one that we for sure have not detected definitively is tuberculosis. All of these others have been detected in Mississippi. So let's drill down just a little bit more into some of these topics. Let's talk about the concentration of wildlife and look at what some of the research has shown us. And again, we looked at research not just here, but across the nation and across the world. We looked at papers that have synthesized all of this research, and we're just highlighting some of these here. This is certainly not an all-inclusive list. But just some research out of Mississippi showed that deer-to-deer contact now, so we talked about urine and saliva and feces being concentrated at these sites, but there also is the direct contact and direct interaction that we see from wildlife. So in the case of deer, deer-to-deer contact was 4 times greater at feeder sites than in food plots. Also, those social groups use the same feeder sites. Again, we talked a little bit about that in the wildlife interaction just a minute ago. Those doe groups interact at those feeder sites where ordinarily on the landscape they would not have as much interaction and contact together. Michigan has done a lot of research on this, given with tuberculosis and brucellosis and CWD. They looked at feeding sites and looked at deer use of those. Fall baiting stations led to extensive face-to-face contact at those feeding sites in Michigan, as well as direct and environmental contacts at bait sites far exceeded food plots and naturally occurring forage in Michigan. Also, a very interesting study out of Texas where they put pit tags in animals. There was multiple species that they put pit tags in. They actually put pit tag readers on the feeders, and as those animals came by the feeders, it logged their contact with that feeder. And based on the amount of corn that was used in that study, and that scaled up to the state of Texas, and the amount of corn that they use in Texas, they would have estimated 5.2 billion unnatural contact events between wildlife at feeder sites in Texas. You can imagine the amount of contact on the landscape by multiple species in a place like Texas, estimated at 5.2 billion contacts. That's a lot of interaction between wildlife that, again, would not ordinarily occur on the landscape. A little bit about the disease agents themselves. Okay, so these are the things that actually spread the disease, again, whether it's a fungus or a viral or bacteria, whatever it may be. MSU research showed that fecal material of white-tailed deer was 2 times greater, and raccoons was 4 times greater at feeder sites than at unfed sites. And for something like coccidia or nematodes, which is parasitic, it's highly concentrated in the feces. And coccidia was 3 times greater at fed sites. Nematodes were 2 times greater at fed sites than unfed sites. So the opportunity for those parasites to be picked up, particularly for something like wild turkeys or bobwhite quail, which has detrimental effects to their digestive system, is much greater at fed sites than unfed sites. Another one that's very interesting is a study done by MSU actually looking at prion presence at feeders. And so MSU did a research project in North Mississippi where feeders were established in a CWD zone, and they looked at from around October through March. They looked at deer use of those feeders, and they swabbed those feeders every month, and they tested those swabs. And by the end of the study, every feeder, these were brand new feeders, they'd never been used before on the landscape or anywhere. These feeders were all positive for CWD simply by the deer coming in contact with the feeders, interacting with those feeders, licking on those feeders, eating out of those feeders. All of those feeders became positive for CWD. And we'll talk here in the next slide or so about feeders that only were used by raccoons and how CWD was present on those. So you can see that the concentration of disease agents and the opportunity for those agents to be picked up by other wildlife is certainly much greater at fed sites. Let's talk about the movement of those disease agents. So this is, again, another example here from our partners at MSU. So beyond just the risk of deer-to-deer contact or other wildlife contact with each other at these sites, or the environmental loadings of these disease agents being around these feeder sites, there's also the opportunity for those agents to be picked up by certain wildlife species and carried elsewhere. So in this particular case, let's talk about CWD. So the same study that was looking at whether prions were present on those feeders that deer had access to, they actually established feeders that only raccoons had access to. They were completely excluded by deer use. All of those feeders that had access by raccoons were positive for CWD. Subsequent testing of those raccoons found that prions were present on their paws. So the belief here is that these raccoons were feeding at the same feeders as deer. They were picking up those prions and they were depositing them on the feeders that only they had access to. So we see here that those prions were being picked up by non-deer species and carried somewhere else. So the opportunity for those prions to be distributed across the landscape because of the concentration of feeders is certainly evident there. So some few pictures here, just to kind of put your mind's eye that the opportunity for diseased animals to be using feeders and be on the landscape, again, is evidenced by trail cams here. So you can see in the top left there, you have a diseased deer. For whatever reason, this deer is sick. We don't know the reason, but this deer actually died eating under this feeder. You can see on the top right here, you can see this deer died under the feeder. And then the next day, a picture from the landowner here with the deer still dead under the feeder. But really the take-home point here is if you look at this feeder site, the excessive use here of this feeder, just the dirt here, this feeder's been used over and over and over again by deer and other wildlife species. So again, going back to the concentration of feces and saliva and urine here, and the disease vectors that may be present here, and the opportunity for animals to pick those up and carry it across the landscape. But again, you can look at the use here compared to a food plot next door to it. You can see the use is absolutely excessive there on these feeders. Another example here, in the case of turkeys, you can see a picture. This picture is actually out of Wayne County. This turkey likely has avian pox. You can see the scabs there on that turkey's head. This turkey is using a feeder site, certainly had the opportunity to spread viral pox there at that feeder site. A hen with her poults there eating out of a trough feeder. So you can imagine a turkey with avian pox feeding here, and the opportunity for these young poults to pick up pox, develop pox, and it affect their digestive system and likely affects their health and reproductive opportunity. And then we talked about coccidia. Coccidia loads concentration in the feces of coons. Certainly the opportunity for these, in this case, these young turkey poults to pick up coccidia, a parasitic, in their digestive system, a parasite problem in their digestive system, certainly exponentially increases by concentrating raccoons around feeder sites. So absolutely, diseased animals do use these feeder sites, and the opportunity for healthy animals to pick up those parasites or that bacteria or those viruses, whatever it may be, exponentially increases at feeder locations. So some other considerations in the context, again, of talking about disease risk. And these also have to be included to frame this whole discussion around supplemental feeding and the impacts. One of those is the effects on non-targets. Certainly there's a belief out there that by feeding raccoons and hogs and bringing them into these locations, is it actually benefiting their populations? And there's a lot of discussion now about predators and their impacts on game bird populations. So are we actually benefiting predators by feeding on the landscape? Are we impacting hog populations? Certainly that's something that needs to be looked at. Habitat degradation. What are we doing to the habitat on the landscape? There's some research out of MSU that was done in the last several years looking at how animals coming to central locations over and over again actually degrades the natural habitat around those feeders. The effects on home range and movement of wildlife. How are we affecting how animals normally develop home ranges on the landscape, how they move on the landscape? Are we affecting what they do naturally? The effects on harvest success. A lot of times, again, we feed on the landscape to facilitate harvest, but are we really facilitating harvest? Are we increasing the opportunity to harvest deer? Are we harvesting more deer with feeding on the landscape? Certainly that's a question that needs to be asked and looked at. And again, the overall effects of feeding on wildlife health and physical condition. Are we actually benefiting these animals? In some studies, in some cases, they're looking at whether there's actually more stress induced because animals are concentrated at these feeder sites, they're competing for resources, and actually in some cases it may not be benefiting animals, maybe actually doing the opposite. So certainly that's something that needs to be looked at. And then the effects of things like nest location and success. Are turkeys more inclined to nest near feeders, and again with predators concentrated around feeders? Are we actually negating what we're trying to do on the landscape? So certainly all of these ancillary considerations need to be factored into a discussion around feeders. Wildlife disease risk is certainly great, but these other factors are certainly part of the conversation. So final slide here to summarize this. Wildlife diseases are a significant conservation issue. I think all across the nation and the world there is great concern about diseases in wildlife and what's going to happen to wildlife in the future. And one thing we really didn't talk about a lot in this presentation is what is the risk to humans. A lot of it, or multiple of the diseases that I showed you here on the slide are what we call zoonotic. That humans can certainly get those. Tuberculosis, toxoplasmosis, those diseases can be picked up by humans and they can affect humans. So that's certainly something that needs to be discussed. Obviously, we've shown that wildlife can be concentrated around these feeder sites, and that exponentially increases the opportunity for these diseases to be spread, whether it's direct contact or interaction with the environment, interaction with these disease vectors. And there's a large body of feeding research out there that indicates absolutely the disease risk far outweighs the benefits of supplemental feeding. Again, only in the context here of disease and disease risk, not talking about all of the other factors that are here. This is strictly talking about disease risk, that absolutely the risk is greater than the benefits of feeding. And I'll leave you with this quote here from a paper. This was a synthesis that was done by some researchers out of Canada. They looked at all of the research that was done on feeding, and they evaluated it from the risk of disease in baiting and feeding. And this was actually the final sentence of this paper, and I'll read it for those who may not can see it. However, given the ongoing challenges of addressing wildlife disease issues and the role of baiting, it seems unlikely that diseases will be successfully eradicated or even managed while widespread baiting and feeding is permitted. So again, only in the context of feeding here, research indicates that the risk is certainly far greater than the benefits. So certainly as we move forward in this discussion about supplemental feeding, we move forward in the discussion about chronic wasting disease and other diseases, this is certainly an important conversation to have, and it's certainly important for us to continue to look into this topic and work with our colleagues like with MSU and others, evaluating the risk of disease and the role that supplemental feeding may be playing into the transmission of disease, the risk on the landscape, and what that means for wildlife health in the future, and what it may mean for human health in the future, and how we move forward for here. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity for us, allowing us to put this together for you all, and we'll certainly entertain any questions, or we're glad to have conversations down the road. So,
Anybody on the commission like to ask Russ any?
President, those different diseases that you listed, could you explain what each one of those are?
Can you put
the
that,
audience and
put that slide
we
back?
probably don't know exactly what they are and what they do.
sure. And let me preface this by saying that I'm not a pathologist or a disease ecologist or a virologist or any of those things, and I'll do the best I can with this.
Yeah, just general understanding would be good. Yes.
Sure. So apoptoxicosis, so this is toxins produced by a fungus that is actually on the feed itself. So Corn, let's take a corn for an example. There may be fungus on that corn, and that fungus will produce a toxin. And when those toxins are ingested, it causes aflatoxicosis in wildlife. This is certainly for birds, especially like things like wild turkeys. This is certainly a risk, and certainly something that absolutely impacts game birds. Avian pox, again, is a virus. And again, this is strictly, well, I shouldn't say strictly for birds, but primarily affects birds. So in our case, talking about turkeys and quail, it's produced or caused by a virus there. And a lot of times you'll see pictures of them with lesions and scales and stuff on their head, but it actually can also cause problems internally as well. Tuberculosis, many of you have heard about TB. It actually, it obviously occurs in cattle and other wildlife, but certainly occurs in humans. But it's a bacterial infection, primarily affects the respiratory system and the lungs, causes lesions, can cause respiratory breakdown. In some cases, it can cause death. Certainly humans have died of tuberculosis. Brucellosis is a bacterial infection that we know causes abortions, reproductive problems in cattle and other bovines. But it also can cause inflammation of the joints and cause mobility problems there, and in some cases can cause death. CWD is a prion, a misfolded protein. You've heard a lot of discussions about prions over the past several years with the CWD being present on the landscape. Coccidiosis, we talked a little more about it in the presentation. It's a parasite. It is, when it's ingested, it gets into the digestive system, causes a lot of digestive problems and again, a lot of game birds that pick this up, that parasite living in the host. Leptospirosis, which is a bacteria, when it's ingested, can cause a lot of problems. Depending on the host, depending on the species, can cause different problems, different kind of breakdowns in the actual animal itself. Again, depending on what picks up lepto. But certainly this is a zoonotic disease. Humans can have leptospirosis. And then toxoplasmosis, which again is a parasite. And again, depending on the host, can do different things there, can cause encephalitis, other things there. And you'll see a lot of this more in mammals, but it's certainly a disease there that's a problem. So, Mr. Munger, I hope that kind of gets a little bit at some of these diseases.
I got a question, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Y'all conducted the test on the feeders in the CWD zones, and there was detected CWD on those different feeders, the new feeders and everything. Have we done the same thing on the scrapes and the licking branches and stuff like that in CWD zones? Has there been tests conducted in those areas like that?
Yes, so there's been scrape samples in the zone and outside of the zones and the licking branches. Yes, looking.
Are we finding CWD in those as well?
So some of the areas that have been tested outside of CWD zone, yes, like Claiborne County,
right?
For example, before we found a positive animal, it was found in those scrapes and those licking branches. Yes.
But like, I'm assuming, where'd they do the test you're talking about with the feeder? Is that Benton, Marshall County?
Benton County, yes.
Have we done any scrape testing in other areas where deer congregate to see if the disease is present?
So the only environmental testing that's been done here is going to be in the scrapes and the licking branches.
The only one that's done where now?
The only environmental testing outside of the feeders is going to be in the scrapes and the licking branches. And this is science is developing, and hopefully it's going to be, a canary in the coal mine, if you will.
But did we do those tests in the CWD zone?
Yes.
Okay, and was it detected in scrapes and?
Yes.
Okay, that's it. All right, and then on the examples of all these bad diseases up here, is there any cases where we have found that these diseases have passed from a cervid to a human, a deer to a human, I guess, if you will?
So again, in the case of like CWD, there's been no documented case where CWD has been contracted from a white-tailed deer. Has there been documented cases where folks have had one of these diseases in humans? Yes, they've been documented.
Well, I know we have tuberculosis or those types of things that you talked about, but what I'm saying is there's documentation that we're sure that those diseases came from the transmission of a deer to a human.
I could not definitively say that based on the research that we looked at. But may that be possible? Has it happened? Certainly can look into that to see.
Okay, I just think it's super important that we educate the public as best we can. But if we don't have definitive information on public health issues and stuff such as that, I think it's irresponsible for us to even put that notion into the general public's mind that there's a possibility that CWD can be transmitted to a human. I'm with you. It might. We don't know. But when we start talking like that, I just think it's irresponsible of us.
So,
I've been hearing a lot of that.
But if I can, let me go back to the very title slide of this. We've couched this discussion as risk. We are not saying in any form or fashion that, by gosh, you'll get leptospirosis, but we said this is risk.
I'm with you, Russ, but let me tell you what John Q. Citizen and Susie Q. Citizen here, they hear CWD, human, oh my gosh, I'm not gonna deer hunt anymore. I'm not gonna eat the deer that we kill because we're not real sure if it has CWD. What that equates to is less people buying license to support our department stuff. I'm trying to be as professional about this as, because I appreciate what y'all do. I'm prepared to make the motion today, which I wish our whole board was here. I'm prepared to make the motion today to do a statewide supplemental ban. And I'm probably gonna need armed guards from all my buddies that I hunt with and, you know, and all those things. But I'm prepared to do that. I don't just give lip service. So, but I wish our department would do a better job of not trying to use the tactics of, well, this could possibly go to a human. All they hear is disease, human, period, end of story. So, anyway, thank you for putting this together today.
Thank you, Mr. Spence.
I know, I'm in the cattle business, and we have a disease called antiplasmosis, just similar to this. And I put out medicine in the summertime. We don't do it in the wintertime. It's oromycin. And you have to go to a vet and get a prescription and then go to the feed store to buy it. And I do it, and it's expensive, but it prevents the cows from getting plasmosis. Is it anybody done any research on feeders, for instance, put some kind of oromycin or whatever in the feeder to keep the, give them some, antibiotic or whatever they want to call it?
Yeah, so if you look at some of the research on some of these mosis or sporosis, they are treatable, and in controlled settings, they've treated a certain species, and they've gotten over that for whatever it may be, which one we're talking about here. They have gotten over that, or in some cases, some animals naturally fight it off and are okay. But in a broad setting, in a broad scale setting like we're talking about, would that be feasible? Would a medicated feed or something be feasible to do on a broad landscape? That's certainly something that would take a lot more research and expertise looking at. But in controlled settings like you're asking about, those trials have been done, and some of these have been treatable. So.
They sure like that medicated salt for some reason. They eat it up like it's ice cream. Cattle do. But it prevents them from getting the plasmosis. And I know you know it, but if you would see a cow that's got the antiplas, their symptoms are almost identical to what you see in a deer that's got CWD. I mean, they lose weight, they swallow it, they get off by themselves, they wander around in circles like what you've heard about deer. Cow do the same thing if you don't give them the medication. So I'm just thinking maybe, I don't know how much it would cost to put medication out there, because I'm only doing it for 50 cows, not 10 million deer.
Right.
And we've heard, and I don't think Dr. Strickland's presentation was public last time, or maybe it was.
It was mighty good.
Yeah, it was. And but we are learning that the only thing, and I'm probably gonna get this wrong, Russ, so keep me straight. The only thing that kills, you can't kill the prion, but what denatures it, is that right? Mm-hmm. That denatures a prion that we know of is humic acid. Is that accurate?
So some of the research has shown that humic acid degrades the prions.
Okay.
Does that make them non-infectious, or does it make them still not present? Still got to be research on that.
I'm with you 100%. I was fixing to go into that. There's not a way that we can put humic acid in a deer that we know of, but the only thing that we can do is possibly treat soils. Is that right? I'm trying to educate the public here so they can, you know, you get all the little TikTok. They make fun of me when I sent that humic acid TikTok to them, and I told them, I said, I don't know. And then lo and behold, I was speaking to one of our biologists one day, and he says, well, let me tell you, the only thing and how they found it is through earthworms, and because the earthworm releases humic acid and it denatured it, if I'm saying that correctly. What I'm trying to ask, is there any studies going on out there, because we've been studying it for 50 plus years? You would think if we know one thing that actually denatures it or slows it down, that all the funding sources, everything under the sun regarding CWD would be thrown at the humic acid possibility or theory or whatever y'all call it in the scientific world, to be able to say, hey, we might be onto something here. But you know, you don't ever hear that, and according to what the biologist told me, that is the only thing that they know of that denatures it. Or maybe bleach?
Yeah, bleach.
Bleach.
Right.
Okay, well, bleach just about kills everything. And you can drink a little bit of it too, by the way. But anyway,
I'm gonna take your word for that.
yeah. You want to sterilize some water, that's how you do it. But anyway, you know, those are the types of things that we really need to be looking at and really be throwing our resources at. Hey, there's something there. Let's see if it's a farce, or if it's real, or you know, if it's just something. So I do speak to biologists from time to time, you know. So anyway,
They're all right.
That's yeah, they are good people. Work hard.
I see, my good friend William McKinley, President McKinley back there. You got anything you want to add to this?
I will add that humic acid does denature the prions.
William, why don't you come up here where the public can see you?
Come to the microphone.
Yeah.
It'd be great.
He's
Being
our-
in that back room back there wasn't good. You need to be up here in the public where we can all be heard.
He's our main deer man. Go ahead, William.
So humic acid does denature prions. That's been shown, and there is a lot of research ongoing with that. There are prion institutes set up all over this country, in fact, all over the continent, that are studying CWD and other prion diseases. Humic acid is one of the hope fors. It does seem that when soil is treated, it will have an effect on denaturing the prions. There is some research on prescribed fire that it may actually cause the prions to bind with clay particles and not be as readily available. There's a lot of research, so you are correct. There's research ongoing on it, and there's hope that, but that's still not treating the source of the prion, which is the live deer walking around spreading it, that is positive. So
Right.
we can't just treat the soil and expect it to go away when the deer are continually putting it back out.
I got that, but we have something that actually denatures CWD, and I'm the non-scientific commissioner on the board, and the public is probably hearing this from the non-scientific commissioner. We should have been having these discussions, educating the commission on, hey, there is something going on out there, not just, hey, you know, if we put a feeder out, it's going to spread CWD, or hey, it's going to be transmitted to humans. You know, there's a possibility it's going to be not once have, other than me asking the questions, have we even had a discussion about humic acid and educating the general public on there is something there. Hey, it might only clean the ground up, but that's a start. Before humic acid, we didn't know what could clean the ground up, right? So, anyway, that's just you know, we're always on the doom and gloom, and it is a tough disease. Make no mistake about it. But at the same time, we need to educate the public on some of the positive things that's going on with CWD. Not just we starting this new study and we found another detected deer, and now we're finding them in licking branches, and they're all over feeders, and they're on this and they're on that. It would be nice to hear a little bit of positive about, hey, humic acid can denature. You've educated me on that, and I appreciate it, and amongst others. So those are just some of the things that you would think the general public would want to know, and I know this commission would want to know, Because they did make fun of me when I sent them that humic acid TikTok. They said it's gotta be true, it's on the internet.
Well, there was some misunderstanding on humic acid of how you apply it.
Yeah.
And just feeding it to a deer, putting it in feed that was not the proper manner. So it got blew up a bit. I know what you're referring to.
I have never thought that you could put it into a deer, but, you know,
I wish it was that easy.
Oh, I do too. Absolutely. We all do. Everybody in the state and the country does. But just a little bit more informant of the public would be nice on some positive things. And that I look at that as a positive in this CWD couch discussion that we're having.
One of the recent studies that was presented at Deer Study Group last month was bleach. We've known bleach denatures it, and it is now shown that it can be of much lower concentration for a much shorter period of time. So just wiping down a knife blade with a solution of bleach and then rinsing it appears to they could not find prions on the blade after that. They could find them before that. So as far as cleaning equipment, it used to be recommended you had to leave it for a certain amount of time, soaking in bleach, which would corrode the knife. And so there's one more little bit of bleach is actually way more effective than previously thought.
Yeah.
So
One logical thing
Thank you.
on humic acid is in the free-ranging environment, it's not practical to put humic acid on thousands of acres.
We
So-
know that.
Right.
So that's just logical. It's just, as you said, it's great, like in a high fence or around a feeder, you could maybe use it, but it's just, for the general public and all of our land, it's just not a solution, but it's encouraging. But another thing that, a little bit encouraging, not necessarily for free ranging, but tell us where the live test for the disease might be at this point.
So they're gaining traction. We hope that soon there'll be a USDA approved live test. I keep hearing that's in the works a few months out. It's being used in Texas in a captive setting already, even though it's not USDA approved. But to clarify, if this test comes back as reacting, the deer is not labeled as positive. It still has to be one of the USDA approved tests, but it's being used somewhat as a screening test, and they're using that on quite a bit in Texas now. And I think in Missouri as well, possibly. Well, I take that back. There's one other state other than Texas using, I can't remember which state it is offhand. So,
Is it impractical to maybe, I don't even know the form of of humic acid. Is it a liquid form? Is it a granular form? I mean, do you know?
I think it comes in multiple forms. It's applied to ag fields a lot. So
Right.
it's a good thing for the crops as well.
So is it somewhat practical maybe for a hunting camp to get one of them little 1 gallon sprayers and go spray their deer feeders and stuff like that?
I've never seen any research on spraying the actual metal. It's usually used in soil treatments. I don't know. I
That'd
can't
probably
answer
be a
that.
good start, you know. I know you can't kill it, but it denatures CWD. And hey, let's just go try and spray it on our $100 feeder out there. It might eat the feeder to the ground, but let's just try it, you know. Why aren't we doing studies on stuff such as that? Look, that's just common sense to me.
Makes sense.
There is a lot of research ongoing, and not in Mississippi on it specifically, but at the Prion Institutes. When I was in, the department allowed me to go to Denver back
Yeah.
in May to the International CWD
I remember.
Symposium, and learned quite a bit. You know, that meeting was several hundred people. I would estimate roughly 60% of the audience were lab type people who worked on CWD research across the world, actually. Primarily in Canada and U.S. at places like a Rocky Mountain Prion Institute and others, but about 30% of that meeting were managers, such as myself, either from state, federal, or tribal, and about 10% were deer farmers coming together to talk about the risk of this disease and how, the deer farmers stated at that meeting that, it's one of the largest risks to to their industry there, is CWD, because we just haven't figured out a good solution for this. But I will say there is a tremendous amount of research from all aspects going on worldwide on this disease.
You think if it would be the will of the commission that maybe we can get a resolution to send to the Prion Institute and say, hey, the Wildlife Commission in Mississippi said, would y'all put this on your radar screen of testing the humic acid on spraying feeders and stuff such as that? You know, we might be on the map as the cutting edge. Dang, why didn't anybody else think of that? Or just pick the phone up. Hey, you know, is there a possibility we can put this into a study?
You can fund a study at Mississippi State. I bet you can.
Well,
We can.
Coster will have to get us the money.
They got money.
It's worth.
So anyway,
It's worth looking at.
I'm not being adversarial. I'm just.
No,
this
sir,
is
I don't
kinda
take it
common
as that
sense
at
stuff to me.
all. I'm just thinking of what research, I have no idea how much research, until I got to that meeting, I had no idea there was even a fraction that much research already ongoing, so I would bet there that people are already looking at. I know there's a lot of research, I'm just not familiar
I
with
got
it,
you. Understood.
on the application of humic acid.
I understand.
And switching the subject a little bit, I guess the Mississippi State study, there's 118,000 feeders and there's probably more than that, but is that from an aerial survey, or how did they?
It was part of a deer-pig interaction study, looking at with GPS collars on how frequently deer and pigs actually interact together, with the most likely location that they're going to come together would be at a feed site. And so in order to figure out how many of those location areas, they flew fixed-wing transects across the state, just shy of, well, it was a little over 1,200 miles of transect. So they flew from the coast all the way to the Tennessee line, to the Delta, to the east side of the state and Alabama line, and they flew multiple transects, generated a number of the amount of feed sites they could spot. They were surveying roughly almost exactly a 1 mile bandwidth as they flew across. So, and by that, they were able to generate a number of feeders per square mile, and then to get the number that 118,000, it was just under 118. It was 117,739 is what the number came out. But that's just applied to the total square miles in Mississippi. So,
So anyway, so that's fairly accurate, and obviously probably couldn't see a lot of them that are in the.
right, that's a
in the woods or
minimum.
whatever,
They
those
considered
could
that a
see.
minimum number because feeders in trees in the woods were not able to be seen. So they did some flights and flew over some of known location and could see. They were able to proof it pretty well. It's close, but it's a minimum number most likely.
Right, so I mean, obviously, if we consider, or consider anything like getting a statewide ban on supplemental feeding, there's a lot of people involved.
It
There's
is.
a lot of economic impact, and, you know,
Certainly.
people that are selling feed and corn and all that, so it's a big issue, and obviously this supplemental feeding became legal in Mississippi before our time. When did it happen? Y'all remember when? 2007, so. we've
With
been-
regulations that have since been, it's been changed a lot since then. I think it was pelleted feed and corn at certain times that could not be intermixed at certain times. Then there was a within sight, out of line of sight. A lot of things were added at the beginning that have since been taken off. So
And within high fences, oftentimes it's essential to have supplemental feeding because the habitat doesn't support it.
it depends on how many deer they're running. I've been in most of them, and the ones that are, I know of some that do not supplementally feed or do it to a very minimal basis, I would say. They have trouble getting deer to eat it because they keep their deer density quite balanced inside. So
that's, I guess, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, as far as
That's gonna be a part of my motion.
within high fences and outside, obviously, if you banned it, it wouldn't be within high fences.
My motion's not gonna be, I mean, how do you sustain a herd within a high fence? And yes, I'm for high fences.
Yeah, you would have to bring the density down to a level that's balanced with the habitat. So I know of some that, as I said, that do not, or supplementally feed to a minimum. I know of some that are growing 3-acre soybean fields and not getting deer damage on them because they keep their density down at a level that they can actually make beans on a 3-acre field. But the majority of them that I have entered have a very high deer density above the natural carrying capacity. Thus, they have to feed to support the number of deer that are there. So if that were the case, they would certainly have to reduce the deer density, in some cases quite drastically, to be able to keep those deer in a healthy condition.
Right. And the states around us, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, they all have feeding or whatever you want to call it, right? And have any of those states talked about changing that?
I'm not aware that they have talked about it,
Yeah.
so.
I'm just trying to think of the things we all should consider, that's all. I don't know the answers.
I know, Louisiana banned most of them banned supplemental, I guess all of those you mentioned banned supplemental feeding within their CWD zone as we have. I think my cohort there in Louisiana told me Tensas Parish saw a very high deer harvest in Tensas Parish after they banned supplemental feeding. So on their reporting, I think it was a record high for 2 years in a row, seeing more deer harvested once the feed was actually removed there.
I think we need to move along. We got a commission meeting in about 7 to 8 minutes.
Let me ask William one
Yes,
question,
sir.
kind of just to wrap it up a little bit, William. To your knowledge, obviously we've done a lot of feeders in the state of Mississippi now.
Yes, sir.
To your knowledge, is there anything with the deer farmers or anyone else, Leonard mentioned the humic acid deal, is there anything that anyone's doing now that could be done to help prevent the spread of disease from feeders?
That I know of currently, no, sir. Obviously, if they were cleaned with bleach on a regular basis, I would assume, I don't have a study behind that, but if they were cleaned routinely with bleach, we know bleach denatures it on stainless steel and other metals, that would be a possibility.
What about the ground around the feeders? Is there any way to treat that?
And that's where humic acid may be a possibility, but the study showed that while the ground, I don't know what humic acid would do to any of this other list here. If we're dealing just with CWD, possibly. It might help. I don't have a study showing concretely that it would, that I can reach in and take out of here currently.
Well, let me just say this. I know y'all are doing what you can and keeping up with the research, but like Leonard said, if there's anything that becomes available that would help the Mississippi sportsman,
Yes, sir.
treat or manage this disease better, please make sure you keep the commission and us aware of
We
what
certainly
that might
will.
be.
Certainly.
Call that Prion Institute, just pick the phone up. I'll call, give me their number, I'll call them.
I have a few contacts I can make a call. I will check on that and get back with y'all on what has been done with humic acid, because what I realized at the meeting in Denver is the research is so broad, there's no way any one person is likely to keep up with everything that's ongoing, but I will definitely check on the humic acid part and see.
William, the only thing we know that denatures the CWD other than bleach is humic acid, and I cannot fathom that the CWD world has not jumped on this with 2 feet to try and I'm gonna just be quiet, but I mean, it's unbelievable to me. So. And that is not a reflection on you or Russ or any of the wildlife division. It's just, I mean, that is common sense 101. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
That's okay. Let's,
Thank y'all for your presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you. I think everybody in this room is a lot better educated on what's going on. But I think we've made some progress, so that's what it's all about, trying to do better. Let's, I think we got about 5 minutes and we'll start the regular meeting.